Hi, welcome to the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. In today's video, we're going to look at some of the methods I use to get that kind of 12-bit sound in the MPC. Now, I'm not going to pretend and say that this method will get your MPC sounding exactly like an SP1200 or S950 or whatever vintage sampler, but it can get you in the ballpark and it can get you that 12-bit vibe. I've also included a chain effects preset, which you can download, details below. Let's jump in. Okay, so I have a bunch of sounds in the MPC. I have some drum sounds and some samples. I've done some different sounds because I want to show that the settings or the effects chain that I show you, there's no default preset. You can't just apply it to every single sound. So I want to show you what kind of changes, how you need to dial it into particular sounds. You know, just for instance, putting this chain on a kick drum and showing you particular numbers, those numbers are not necessarily going to work on a snare drum or on a sample with some strings and a Rhodes in it, you know. So I want to show you that, you know, try and remember there isn't really default presets for anything because every single sound is different. I'm not going to use Airflavor Pro because it's a plugin that people buy as an extra. I'm going to stick to stock plugins so everyone can use it. And the preset that you can download is just going to be stock plugins, so you don't have to worry about that. Now, one of the first things I do if I'm trying to emulate a particular sound is I do a lot of research. And the internet nowadays, you can find out everything you need to know with a bit of digging. I do a thing called period authentic mixing for clients and mastering as well. And they'll come to me and they'll say, I want my track to sound like it was made in the 70s or made in the 80s or whatever. So I do a lot of research into what mixing desks might have been used, what compressors, EQs, reverbs, all that kind of stuff. So I do research anyway. And if I'm researching a sampler emulation, for instance, you know, I will look into what kind of sample time it had, what anti-aliasing filters it might have had, what sample time, was it mono, was it stereo, bit depth, all that kind of stuff. Because the more information you know, you're going to be armed, you're going to find it easier to dial in that sound and, you know, just know it. And also it's fun just to learn about the sampler that you want to emulate as well. And I want to reiterate that I'm not going to be able to emulate an SP1200 or an S950 or whatever exactly. That's not what I'm trying to do here. What I'm trying to get, I'm going to show you how to get a 12-bit kind of vintage sampler sound and some of the methods that you can use to get there. But this is not a video showing you an exact emulation of a particular piece of hardware because me personally, I don't really see the point in doing that because, you know, you can get close and that's brilliant, but you're never going to get it exact. And even if it was so close that someone couldn't tell the difference, there's still going to be somebody that says it's not exactly the same. I can hear this high resonance frequency or whatever. So I'm not going to go there. I just don't really do it. For me, it's about whether I like the sound of something. I love the sound of the whole 12-bit vintage sampler kind of stuff. I do miss having an SP1200. I have to be honest. I do miss my S950. So, you know, I like to try and, it's a bit of fun, get it in the ballpark, and, you know, and it's a great sound as well. So the first thing I do before I even get into effect chains, etc., is I do sample preparation. And with that, from the research that I've done, I will work out whether it, you know, is it better to have it in mono, you know, normalizing it, that kind of stuff. So one of the first things I do is to put the samples into mono. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, when I used to have an SP1200, you know, these sample times like 10, 12 seconds, S950 hardly any time, MPC 60 hardly any time. So what we used to do so we could double the amount of samples we had in there is we would record in mono and we would have mono samples because that basically doubled the amount of samples that you could have. So mono was a standard thing that you just did, you know, it wasn't, you know, very rarely would you make a stereo sample. And the other thing is as well, especially with drums, is it, you know, you want your drums front and center, so it might as well be in mono anyway. You know, there's no point in having a stereo kick if it's just going to be mixed in a mono way. There just isn't any point. And, you know, and lastly as well is that putting something in mono, which I'll show you in a moment, it creates a sound, a vibe instantly. You know, straight away you can get a sample that might be panned really fast stereo, like let's say a mid-70s Creed Taylor jazz record. You know, he loved stereo field, he loved panning things, But you can instantly give that sample a bit more of a vibe and make it sound much tighter in the mix by making it mono straight away. It takes stuff away from the sides, yeah, but you know, if you're trying to create a vibe, especially that vintage sampler kind of vibe, you know, you have to think about those kind of things, and getting rid of the stereo information is just one way, just one method to kind of start getting yourself in that area. So if we go into sample edit, I'll go through the samples. Now, a lot of the samples that I put in there today are actually samples that I from my old MPC 3000 and 4000. So a lot of them are actually in mono. There might even be some SP1200 ones in there as well. So the ones that are already in mono are from 25, 30 years ago. These 909 samples, for instance, are right off my original 909. So this is probably my SP1200. At a guess, could be the 3000. So, you know, obviously I didn't have to mono those. And yeah, these are, judging by that clap, that's the SP1200. Then I did a couple of sample packs and also some more recent sampling that I've done, which I've done in stereo. So this is actually a pretty good example of when you have a kick drum. This is from a sample pack, this kick drum, for instance. It's a stereo sample. Now, if you've got headphones on, you'll actually be able to hear that whilst it's a kick drum, there's actually some side information. And when I monoed the kick, not only did it put it front and center, it tightens it up by getting rid of this side information. And you really don't, there's no rule, but generally you don't really want side information in the low end. It's you know, there's no rule. You can have side information in the low end if you want. But generally in hip hop and house music, club music, drum and bass, that kind of thing, you tend to try and keep your lows front and center. Just purely because, you know, if you're playing it in big clubs, you don't really want loads of side information going on in the bass. It can just sound pretty terrible. Not always, but most of the time. So let's have a quick listen again to this kick, which was in stereo, then I made it mono. And for me, straight away, that instantly starts sounding more vintage. So that was that kick monoed. This particular kick didn't sound that much different, purely because it doesn't have a lot of side information on, and I have a feeling that it was probably a mono kick sampled in stereo. Not much difference. So going through these, okay, we've got some more mono ones here. Okay, so we get to a sample here. Now, with samples especially, you know, quite often in the 60s and 70s onwards, when they found about, you know, they started using stereo in studios, the engineers would sometimes go a little bit mental and put all the drums there, all the vocals there, etc. So when you do have a sample, you have to assess it. You have to make a decision. Do I want just the right information, just the left information, or do I want it summed in the middle? So, you know, what's great about the MPC, you can go into process here, right to the end, and you can go stereo into mono, and you get a choice. You can have just the left. You can sum both the left and right into the middle, or you can just have the right. So you need to assess each sample individually. You know, generally with drums, most of the time, you know, with these particular drums, for instance, I just summed. But with this sample, actually with this sample, that sample I summed because it was pretty even and I just wanted to make it mono. So let's listen to that in mono. You can instantly sound, it already starts sounding more vintage, and again you've just tightened things up, you've got more control over things in the center. So this loop is a really good example of everything being on one side. On this, the drums were obviously recorded and they were either panned right and some of the reverb was on the left, or just the way that maybe the engineer set the microphones up, possibly using more than one microphone on the kit, overheads. But as you can see, there's more information on the right hand side. So what I did with this one when I processed this, I did go right and I just took the right hand side, and consequently it did actually get rid of a little bit of the reverb and it made it sound a little bit tighter. So that to me already sounds a little bit more vintage just by putting it in the center. This loop, there was a lot of different information and there was a lot of side information as well. So this one, I liked everything. So again, I went for central, summed the left and right channel together. But that to me immediately sounds kind of got a Motown sound to it now instantly, rather than a kind of audiophile jazz sound, because I've made it mono, and a lot of the early Motown recordings were in mono, that whole Atlantic, all that kind of stuff. So that's instantly made it sound a little bit more vintage as well. So that's one of the processes I do, is mono things. And to be honest with you, when I work in the MPC, you know, most of my music is sample based, the stuff I make myself. I do tend to mono things if they weren't already in mono anyway, just purely because the kind of stuff I do tends to have a more lo-fi feeling or a kind of vintage sound to it. And also I like the control that I can have over drums and samples if I've made them mono, because I can always spread them later in the mix anyway, or offset them slightly using the hash effects. I've done a video about that. So, you know, yeah, that's one of the processes, mono in the samples. Now, another process that I will do straight after that is I will go through all of the samples and I will bit reduce to 12-bit. Now, this is a really subtle thing. Now, I don't know whether Akai is actually making your sample, whether it's being processed to be a 12-bit sample, or I don't really know what's going on underneath the hood. If anybody does, please write in the comments. But what I do know is if you reduce it to 12-bit or even down to 8, you don't notice it so much to start with until you get really, really low, about 4. But you do notice it later on when you start applying effects. When I apply lo-fi effects to a sample and I've left it at 16 or I've not touched it at all, yeah, it sounds great, etc. But if I bit reduce all of my samples and mono them and then do exactly the same thing, when I A and B them, it's not night and day. But for me, all the samples that I've put through this particular process, whatever this process might be, it does make a difference, and it does sound a bit grittier, and it's got a little bit more low end, and the artifacts are there in the high end that people like from that whole 12-bit type of crunch stuff. So that's what I do. I do bit reduce on all the samples, and then standard thing that I've always done for absolutely years since they first brought it in. I can't remember whether it was the S1000. Maybe they had it in the S950. Can't remember, but normalize. I've just always done it. Whenever I've worked with Akai stuff, I just normalize the samples. You don't have to do it, especially as the Akai basically turns everything in here into 32-bit floating point. So you don't really have to worry so much about gain staging and that kind of thing. But I just do it out of habit. I just normalize it. It makes it easier for me later on when I'm mixing and for gain staging. But also as well is most plugins have a sweet spot. VST plugins, the MPC plugins, etc. They'll have a sweet spot. And I just find that if you're hitting them with the best volume, not the highest volume, because you don't really want to distort or anything, but normalizing will take the highest peak and normalize everything to that highest peak. So then you're hitting your plugins in the sweet spot most of the time. So just normalizing is just a quick thing to do, quick processing thing to do on your samples. And you know, those are the three things that I do: mono, bit reduce, and normalize before I even start thinking about effects. So once I've done all that preparation, now I actually get into the effects. So obviously everything's turned off at the moment. Now the first thing I do, what I do is I think of it as if it's a sample that's going into a vintage sampler, and then, you know, maybe it's going to come out of the sampler, it's going to go into my desk, then it's going to go into tape, that kind of thing. So I think in that kind of process, because then, you know, because it's important what order you put your chain in, and that runs through everything when you're mixing. You know, you have to think about sometimes, do I put the compressor for the EQ, or do I put EQ for the compressor? Do I put the tape saturation at the start, or do I put it at the end? So think about what you're doing, think about the result that you want to get, and then that will mostly most of the time it will govern what order you put things into. So because I'm trying to emulate a vintage sampler, the first thing I want to do is I want to make the sample kind of 12-bit basically. Now these numbers, this is the Air Lo-Fi plugins. This is the first plugin in the chain. These numbers, don't think that if you turn that to 12 it's going to be exactly like 12-bit. If you turn that sample rate to 26 it's going to be exactly 26 kilohertz. Don't really trust them. Use your ears, get yourself in the ballpark. So in the ballpark would be get this down to 12. I like it to be exactly on 12. I don't like 11.9. Take this down to 26. And basically on 2612, that's supposed to be what an SP1200 would be, for instance. But it might not sound exactly where you want it to sound. So go with that to start with. Save that as a preset. I've got a whole bunch of presets actually, which, hold it, let's just open these up, see if I can. Oh, there we go. Okay, yeah, so here's my presets here. I've got an S950, 7 to 5 kilohertz, an S950, 24 kilohertz. I've got an ASR 10, an MPC 60, 2000, and basically I've set up my own presets. Let's take that back down again, so that I can dial in just a lot quicker. But like I said, they're not going to be exact presets. They're just going to get you in the ballpark quickly. So let's take this back down to 26 again and listen to this beat. So a little bit on the snare and a little bit on the hat, you can hear a little bit of crunch being introduced. But for me, that's not enough. I haven't really got the desired effect. I've got to the beginning of it, if you understand what I mean, but it's not quite there for me yet. So I'll start playing around. I normally leave the bit depth where it is, to be honest. If I want real 8-bit sound, I put that to 8-bit, but it's the sample rate that I adjust that dials the sound in for me. So I'm going to start playing around with that a little bit to dial it in closer to how I remember my SP1200 sounding. Now you could even take it down to about 13k, which is kind of like mono sample area in an SP1200. I mean, see, I love how that sounds. Just instantly gives them life to me. That's how I think of it. But like you can see, you have to dial it in a little bit and go for the sound that you want. Like I said, this is not going to be. This sounds exactly like an S950 or an MPC 60 or SP1200, but dial it in how you want it to sound. If you want it to be really, really gritty, if you want it to still have a little bit of hi-fi to it. So play around with these controls. You can play around with a mix, but I think generally, with something like drums and samples and stuff, if you want to dial in a sound that's a vintage sampler type sort of sound, you don't really need, you just leave the mix on 100%, but by all means play around with the mix. So we'll leave that section for the moment. Let's get onto this section here. Now these are emulating anti-aliasing filters. They're not the best, but they do imprint a little bit of extra to it. So what basically this is, you've got a pre and a post. The pre is emulating the sample going into the sampler, let's say an SP1200, and the post would be emulating the filters as you're coming out of the sampler. So let's say, for instance, okay, you'll see the effect. Basically, the lower you bring it down, what it does is it starts filtering off the high end and the artifacts that you get from that kind of crunchy 12-bit sound. Now, I personally like that crunchy sound, so I don't tend to roll that off very much. And if I do, I don't use these anti-aliasing filters. I might use a tape saturation plugin or a little bit of EQ, just purely because I don't me personally, I'm not that keen on these, but I will show you what they do, because they do imprint a little bit of sound and they do imprint some character, and you might really like that character, so play around with it. Also, it doesn't really start kicking in until you get quite low, so what I'll do is I'll play it and then I'll roll them in. Concentrate on the high end. So for me, it sounds to me like the filters have got maybe a slight resonance peak on them, so it's starting to sound a little bit nasally to me, and that's why I don't like them, because I'm not really a fan of resonant peaks, or resonant filters rather. And so, you know, I don't really use these very often because I don't really like the way that they sound, to be honest. But other people might love them, so that's what they do. Basically, they're supposed to be emulating the anti-aliasing filters that you have on vintage samplers. These controls here, rectify mod on noise mod, I don't touch those because, again, I don't really like the sound that they imprint. But clip, I do use sometimes very subtly, and what clip does for me is it kind of emulates your clipping going into a tape machine, so you get this kind of nice saturation. But I use it very, very subtly. So what I'm going to do is I'll just roll it in, just listen to the low end. You'll start hearing the kick have a little bit of, it's not distortion, just has a bit of crunch, a bit of warmth. So just to show you that this is not going to apply to everything, I'm just going to run through some of the other sounds quickly, and then you'll see that you really have to dial in the sounds if you're using, you know, maybe sample pack straight off vinyl. Honestly, it's all different, and you do have to assess. So, I mean, this kick, for instance, it reacts really well to the sample rate changes, and that's sounding close to an MPC 60 and an SP 1200 for me. When you sample at lower rates on the earlier Akais, maybe, yeah, I mean, it's not quite, it hasn't quite got the low end, but it's still got that kind of ringing sound, which is really nice. But something, actually, that kick's pretty decent. Let's try 909. See, hit 15, not a lot of difference. But playing around with these sample rates, you can hear what I mean. You get that ring, which is that ring that people love. So, you know, play around and decide which kind of ring that you want, you know. And you can play around with the bit depth as well, but I'm going to leave that on 12-bit for the moment, just purely because I'm going for that 12-bit kind of sound. But, you know, do play around with it because you can get some slightly different sounds. See, 909 hi-hats, we're all familiar with that sound. Yeah, I still don't like the sound of those filters at all. So yeah, you can get some nice sounds with that as well. I find that snares and claps, you need to go quite low to start getting that kind of ring sound. Up here, doesn't really sound that much different for me anyway, for my ears. So then let's go into samples. The samples are very different. You really do have to dial those in with actual loops that you've sampled off a track, off a record, vinyl or YouTube or wherever you sample from. So, and again, every single one is going to be different. I find that tracks with strings or Rhodes in, they seem to react a lot nicer to it. And horns react really nicely to it. But I find that guitars don't sound that great. And synth bass sounds really good. But upright bass doesn't sound that great either. But it just depends. You have to dial it in. So let's take clip back a little bit and let's have a listen to this sample. So it sounds nice. And then this one. Yeah, see, I think that's a good example of it doesn't always sound great. On certain samples, it really warms it up. You get that nice kind of vintage sound to it. But other samples, it doesn't always work with it. So again, that's proof that just a preset isn't going to work for everything. You do have to really play around with the settings. I'm sure I could play around with the settings a little bit more on this Air Lo-Fi and get some better sounds out of that particular sample, for instance. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to move on to the next part of the next parts of the chain, and we're going to carry on using that drum beat. I'm going to dial in a little bit of clip, and I'm going to take that to about 17. That sounds decent to me. So the next part of the chain is compressor. So now I'm thinking of coming back out of the sampler and I'm going into the mixing desk. And the reason why I use the compressor vintage, I have actually made a video about all the different compressors in the Akai MPC, so check that out by all means. And I explain a little bit more about the vintage compressor. The reason why I use it in this case is it's emulating tube compression, and you can, with a little bit of dialing in, you can also start getting that SP303 vinyl simulation that everyone's after. I mean, even the new SP404 emulates the old SP303 as close as it can. It's not quite the same, but it's close. And with the compressor vintage, you can dial in the compressor to start getting that kind of sound where you're bringing up the noise floor and it sounds quite tight, but also quite tubey and warm at the same time. So that's what I'll use after the Air Lo-Fi. So let's just dial that in. At the moment, it's just on its default. Listen to the kicks when it's in bypass. They're kind of jumping up and down a little bit. When I put the compressor vintage on it, it levels everything out, tightens everything up, brings up the noise floor a little bit as well, and just kind of creates more of a natural ambience and makes the beat sound a bit more glued together. Considering each one of those sounds all come from different sources, they're not the same drum kit at all. So you can hear what I mean. You're starting to get that tight kind of vinyl sim sound off the SP303. You know, you don't really want to smash it. So, you know, maybe you can use a dry wet to just, once you've got it dialed in, just take it back a little bit. And, you know, play around with the controls. Ratio around about 4 to 6 is pretty decent to get that kind of effect. Slow attack to let the transients through. Fast release to get that kind of transparent, punchy kind of sound to your compressor. But, you know, you can dial the release back a little bit. Play around with it. Do please watch the video where I explain more about compression in the Akai, because it will go into a lot more detail. But let's just listen to... Yeah, okay, so I want to put this drum beat through it, this break that I've sampled, because this will be, because it's not separate drum sounds, it's got the room sound included in there from the original reverb in the studio where it's recorded. And you'll hear that this compressor kind of brings that up a little bit, glues it, but brings everything up. And you kind of, this you really do start getting that kind of vinyl sim sound. I always forget that you don't have to touch that, you can just use the cue links. I'm still don't use cue links very often. I still use the data wheel for everything. Old habits die hard. So just did it again. So then, yeah, so there we go with the compression that I'll use. Really trying to sort of emulate a bit of tube compression and a bit of warmth, and pretending in my mind that it's coming out of the sampler and going into your mixing desk. Then the next part will be some EQ, and this again will depend completely on what sample you're using, etc. So we'll use it on the beat. So all I've really done there is just some pretty standard moves that you do on a drum bus, really just bringing up the low end a little bit, around about 80, dipped out a little bit of mud, just because of the kick sounded a little bit muddy, around about 220. And quite often with this style of beat, using a kind of emulation of an old sampler, I find that between 600 and 750 sounds nice, sometimes boosted a little bit, so I've boosted that slightly, and then I've just given it a little bit of high end. And that, you know, I mean, this is totally specific to whatever sample you're using. So, you know, don't follow the settings on here for what sample you're using, because it's just not going to work. But it's just really demonstrating that, you know, on the chain I have the lo-fi, the compressor, and then the EQ. The reason why I use PEQ is because it's kind of like a Pultec. That's kind of what it's emulating, and it does imprint a little bit of character. It's not transparent like some of the other EQs in the MPC, so I like to use that, and it's more of a broad stroke EQ as well, so it's useful. But you know, like I said, that is totally source specific to whatever you happen to sample or whatever you're putting through there. And then finally, very, very simple, and you've seen me do this in videos before, I just put the MPC 60 on the end. Now, as I've explained before in other videos, it's not because it makes your sound, your samples or your beats or your track sound instantly like an MPC 60. Firstly, I don't care whether that's the case or not. Secondly, I'm telling you it doesn't. But thirdly, the reason why I like using the MPC 60 is because I like the sound that it imprints. And that's what it should be about. You know, the other vintage emulations that you have in there, the SP1200, the 3000 and the SP1200 Ring, they're all good as well. I just prefer the MPC 60, which is why I always use it. But by all means, experiment with those because they do add a bit of character. The reason why I like the MPC 60 is because it really it adds a nice kind of warm, beefy low end, but without sounding like you've added loads of EQ on there. It sounds very natural, and it's still got quite kind of punchy. It doesn't muddy everything up and suddenly start sounding all boomy and stuff. It's just a really nice, tight, warm end. Listen to the kick drums especially. I'll drop it in and out of bypass. Just take it out, let your ears get used to it, then I'll drop it in. Just gives the low end a little bit more oomph. Now just quickly, let's just turn all of this off. Okay, there's the beat. And you can actually go into Program Edit and use the drum effects. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, just purely because I'm actually going to make a video about the drum effects, just a video purely focusing on that. But they're actually pretty cool, and I don't really use anything other than the bit crusher and the decimator, sometimes a soft clipper. Like I said, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the bit crusher and the decimator do actually sound pretty decent. I find that from about 3.7 to about 4.2 for me personally, and then I take this to around about 10. This is what I'm talking about. Don't necessarily think the numbers, oh, it's 12-bit sample, I have to set this to 12 bits. Dial it in, So if you listen to the difference between 3.9, got that on 10 bits, 3.9. You see, 4.1, it starts having that little kind of ring. So it's pretty decent, it does imprint that kind of vintage sampler sound, but you don't have as much control over it. But I am going to do a video on the drum effects in a lot more detail. And that's it. That's just one of the ways, one of the chains that I use to kind of get that vintage sound. But you need to experiment, and I said it throughout the video, use your ears, don't necessarily look at the numbers on the screen, and dial it in how you want it to sound. If you spend, this is just my personal opinion, if you spend your entire time chasing the sound of another sampler, or chasing the sound of converters or a particular mixing board, etc., you're going to drive yourself mental. So a better thing to do, in my opinion, is to have a vibe in your mind where you want to go, where you want the frequencies to be, how you want the sound overall, and then start your work, do your preparation, do your research, and dial it in how you want it to sound. Make it your own sound. This is your version of how you want your 12-bit vintage sampler type of thing to sound. Don't focus too much on trying to get it to sound exactly like something, because I've done that. I've been there, And I have found from personal experience that what it does is you lose your focus and you spend all your time trying to dial in the sound, and then you forget about what you're supposed to be doing. You forget what you're doing about when you're making the track. You just lose your focus completely, and it's really not that important. You know, it's obviously it's more important to make the track. It's more important to enjoy yourself. But you know, by all means, spend a bit of time. You know, use the chain effects preset that I've provided. Download it, have that as a starting point, and dial it in. And as I have said throughout the video quite a few times, every single sample is going to be different. So don't copy my numbers exactly, but my numbers will get you in the ballpark. Like the chain will get you in the ballpark, and then you can adjust it how you want it. And hopefully this video is also giving you some inspiration or some ideas on how you can kind of dial in that kind of whole vintage sampler sound. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more mixing, mastering and MPC tutorials and reviews. This is the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. Till next time.